Greetings and welcome to our daily walk through the scripture for July the 3rd. Your readings for today find you wrapping up the book of 2 Kings. You start in chapter 23, verse 31, and you go all the way through the end to chapter 25. Also, we find ourselves in front of the Sanhedrin with Paul in Acts chapter 22, starting in verse 17, going all the way through Acts 23, verse 10. We also find ourselves rereading Psalm 2 and reading Proverbs chapter 18, verse 13. Now, we've spent a lot of time in the world of 2 Kings lately, and that's because really things have kind of accelerated. It's tough to keep up with actually everything that's been going on. I mean, just last chapter we were reading about Josiah and his reign and finding the temple and all that stuff. But here's the thing, that actually is happening. Oh my goodness, that's like we're about to hit about 80 years worth of history in just 3 chapters. And Josiah is the start of it. But there's a lot of things happening in the world during this time that we need to pay attention to. So when Josiah is king, we talked about the Assyrian Empire kind of being the bad boys on the block. Well, during Josiah's reign, towards the end of it, right after they discover the temple or repair the temple and discover the law, there's a new player in town, the Babylonian Empire. And they actually start destroying and taking down the Assyrians. And so in 612, so just a couple of years after they discover the law, Nineveh falls. And then there's a final huge climactic battle called the Battle of Carchemish. And basically that seals the deal that the Babylonian Empire has now taken over. During this time, we're also seeing the new king, the king of Josiah, the son of Josiah, Jehoahaz, is 23 years old, and he reigns in Jerusalem for a whopping 3 months. And then Jehoiakim takes over. And Jehoiakim gets the privilege of being the king during the first exile. This is when the Babylonian Empire and a familiar name, or at least a name that will become more familiar, a guy by the name of Nebuchadnezzar, shows up, okay? And Nebuchadnezzar we'll find during Daniel's time as well. So this first exile comes, and Nebuchadnezzar comes in, and they raid it, and they manage to, Jerusalem kind of gives up and lets them come in, and basically everybody else is kind of abandoned them. Egypt, even though Egypt was an ally at one point, Egypt's now worthless. They have no power at all. It's just kind of a mess. And so Jehoiakim becomes king, and he does so for about 10 years. And then you have Jehoiachin, not Jehoiakim, but Jehoiachin, who comes in, and he gets to reign for about a year. And then his uncle takes over, Zedekiah. And Zedekiah is basically just a puppet for Nebuchadnezzar. And during that time is when the second exile happens. But Zedekiah gets a little bit of a big head. And as a result of that, he rebels against Babylon. And thus, we see Jerusalem completely fall, and the temple gets destroyed in 586 BC. And this, basically, we call it the third exile, is the fall of Israel as we know it. No longer do Judah and Israel last, and they're gone. And it lasts this way for about 50 years. And so this is going to be, and you'll actually see Daniel have a vision, and it'll talk about the return and all those different things. But remember, there's a lot of turmoil happening here, but we're going to see some of the prophets show up. Jeremiah is a very important book during this time because it really gives us firsthand account of what happens during these exile periods. And then we have Obadiah that comes in. We also have Ezekiel and Daniel that will take and make appearances in this. So this will all be important aspects of it. Now, in terms of Acts chapter 22, really, when you look at Acts chapter 22, Acts chapter 21, and Acts chapter 23, you see some really amazing things because Paul knows what's coming. Remember, we talked about this, that Paul knew that when he got to Jerusalem, there was going to be some pushback, if you will, from the Jewish leaders. They used to love Paul, now they hate Paul. And Paul comes in and he says, you know what, I'm going to tell the truth. And he boldly does so, knowing what's going to happen. But then a very key situation happens in Acts chapter 22. And this is going to play an important part in how Paul ends up in Rome. Because in Romans chapter 22, starting in verse 23 and 24, they order Paul to be flogged. Now, here's the thing about it, though. Paul, as we see here in a minute, is a Roman citizen. And Roman citizens are not allowed to have anything done to them unless they have been put in before a trial, basically a court appearance. And so when they find this out, there's a lot of fear that comes in, and suddenly everything stops. And Paul is now placed under protective rest because he uses his Roman citizenship. And this is going to play an important part, and we'll look more about this in the coming days. But that's kind of it. We finished out 2 Kings. Tomorrow we're going to start 1 Chronicles, and we'll kind of repeat a lot of the things that we just did, but from a slightly different point of view. So we'll see you then.